Good afternoon. I hope everybody enjoyed that wonderful, scrumptious lunch and is ready for supply chain disruption. How many in here actually experienced disruption in the supply chain during the pandemic? Anybody? Amy? There you go. So this will be an exciting, really another great panel, um, and introducing the keynote for this session will be Scott, right? That's him. Yeah. And apparently brings a wealth of experience to supply chain logistics challenges from what industry, Scott?
Mainly aerospace.
Aerospace.
Mainly
Yeah, he was
aerospace,
looking
yeah.
at the ticker over here. Says, "Wow,
Yeah.
in aviation, that's a minus. That would be a bad thing." I said, "Yeah, probably." So, Scott, why don't you just give a little bit of background,
All
and
right.
let's go ahead and get kicked
All
off.
right, let's get kicked off. This thing working all right. So I've been tasked with breaking you out of your post-lunch coma here on the second day. So I am going to accomplish that task to the best of my ability. So as Paul mentioned, I have a fairly eclectic background. What I'm doing today is working with the Virginia MEP Center. I think for those of you who were here yesterday, heard Giodi talk about the manufacturing extension partnerships in each of the states and Puerto Rico. There's a publicly funded resource that helps small and mid-sized manufacturers in a whole host of things, sales, marketing, process improvement, accreditations, ISO, you name it. That's kind of our bread and butter. And as it relates to supply chain, that is the hot topic right now. I'd say that's most of our work right now. And what we do in supply chain is a whole host of things, ranging from supplier development, which I'd say that's at or near the top of the list. And supplier development, as you know, is not just simply finding a supplier. That's the easy part. I can find a supplier who might be able to do a plastic injection molded part. But for them to do what you need to do in the medical device industry is a different story, which is supplier development. And so that's been a key part, especially for those operating in the highly regulated industries, medical device, aerospace, defense. That has been top of the list right now for MEPs. And we're kind of a trusted resource because we're a publicly funded resource. So we're not a boutique consulting firm. We kind of look like it, but that's not really our mission. Our mission is to work with the small and mid-sized manufacturers, which we've touched on some of the issues related to them in the last day or so. As far as my background, very quickly, yes, I've spent most of my career in aerospace and aviation. I was an executive for Airbus down the road some time ago. I left Airbus to acquire an aerospace components manufacturer in Richmond in 2012, despite the anger and response from my CEO. But he saw the entrepreneur in me, wanted to go do it, did it. Sold the company a couple of years ago, was looking for something to do, and I saw this enterprise called MEP and decided to jump in and help out. So that's some of my background. So for today, what I'm hoping I bring to the table is a little bit different perspective from a different industry, highly regulated industry. There's some things going on in aerospace and defense that, and I've talked to Cisco quite a bit about this, why are we not doing some of those in med device? We'll talk about that in a little bit. And also, as an owner operator, I heard some kind of comments around they don't have the expertise or they don't have the resources, and some of these types of comments I often hear from larger companies or organizations. Not totally correct. Not totally correct. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But one thing I was thinking, what chart would demonstrate the criticality of small and mid-sized manufacturers to med device? And I pulled up the FDA Class 1 recall database, as many of you are familiar with, and looked at the trends for devices over the last 10 plus years. And it's not a great trend, as many of you probably are aware. As a matter of fact, in 2022, it was the largest number of Class 1 recalls in 15 years. Now, I've heard different things related to this. The pandemic, supply chain disruptions. Well, The trend started going off the rails in 19, pre-pandemic. It's just gotten worse. Yes, the pandemic probably contributed to that, but there's a systemic problem with small and mid-sized manufacturers who are the number one root cause of FDA Class 1 recalls. They're the number one cause. So it's things like PCB assemblies, plastic injection molded parts. That's what we're talking about. There's a recent instance of a heart monitoring device that had a faulty PCB, printed circuit board assembly, that was not communicating properly with the system, and people were getting injured, and there was a fatality. That's what we're talking about here. They're absolutely critical to the industry, but they're different. To me, small and mid-sized manufacturers, and one thing I failed to mention is I run a medical device pre-audit program for MEP. So nationally, we work with small and mid-sized manufacturers to prepare them for Medicred accreditation, really shooting for that higher level accreditation. And so we have lots of observations on what's going on with this segment of the supply chain. And it is unique, as you all might be able to tell. But there are some calculations going on at that part of the supply chain that I really want to make you all aware of today. So in addition to the patient issues, our friends at McKinsey have quantified a $2.5 to $5 billion annual hit to the industry. This is probably not surprising to most of you in the room, but the focus tends to be the hard costs, the people, the time, the material, the disruption. Then there's the soft costs, which we're talking about, the patient harm, but also the opportunity costs around your product development, the disruption in your product development, the opportunity costs that you lost when that recall occurred, big numbers, cost of scrap, delays in bringing new products to market. Then there's what McKinsey classifies as the hidden costs, which are things like, well, we talked yesterday, culture. It's hard to say I have a culture of quality when I have a rash of FDA Class 1 recalls, right? It's hard to mesh those messages. Difficulty in recruiting. Top talent wants to work with the leaders, right? So I kind of like this breakdown of the costs in the industry because we tend to focus on the hard costs. All right, so great, Scott, what do we do? We'll talk about some of this in the panel, and some of this incorporates what you'll see in aerospace. So again, we spent a lot of time in that middle there on quality. And we heard some comments yesterday, and I agree with it, that quality is everyone's job. Now, when you get into the day-to-day operation, especially of the tier ones and the OEMs, there's different variations on that message. So purchasing especially gets cost pressures that quality doesn't always receive. And that you will see perpetuated in different ways in different companies. Some do more of a total cost of ownership approach where they take in some of the risks and they take in some of the potential hard costs that we just talked about in the last slide. Some don't. Onboarding that requires higher level quality processes. Everyone requires ISO 13485. And I guarantee you, most of the companies that were root caused down in the supply chain on that first chart were ISO 13485. That has proven to not be a sufficient metric in onboarding new suppliers. So more supplier development is needed. And then there's some behaviors in the aerospace industry that could be useful in med device. Things like flow down, not just flow down, but flow up. So when I see an issue and I'm a tier 3 supplier, how's that getting communicated back up through the supply chain so the OEMs and the tier 1s can address it? So in the aerospace world, it's a very regimented way of flowing down requirements in my purchase orders that it is required. So if I looked at my purchase order from my customer, who may or may not be a Boeing or the DoD, it reflects what Boeing and DoD require. That's a different way of doing business in the supply chain. Supplier development, just a different way of approaching it. Some companies view supplier development as a risky situation, onboarding new suppliers. It can be, but it could also not just help you on the cost curve, but it can also help you in managing your risks as it relates to the supply chain. And then management. That's the other part of this. And I'd put leadership instead of management. I think management's one thing. So I'm operationally managing to a target. I have metrics. But leadership is another thing. We need more leadership. What does that mean? So these higher level quality requirements. If I'm managing to a quarter or I'm managing to an earnings estimate or earnings target, then it's going to be tough to demonstrate the leadership needed to require a higher level of quality in my supply chain. And I'm not just talking about your tier ones and OEMs, I'm talking all the way down, that they are required to meet a higher level of quality. And I'm not just saying that. Again, in aerospace, there's a quality accreditation called NADCAP. Has anyone heard of NADCAP in this room? NADCAP, for those unfamiliar, is a heat treating certification that was created after just an absolute atrocious quality history in aviation disasters in the 1970s and 80s. For those of us old like me, we remember those. Now, if you look in the last 10 years, take 737 MAX and put that aside, my friends at Boeing, there were some design issues there. If you put that aside, really, they've done a great job. And NADCAP is one of the reasons for that. And NADCAP looks a lot like Metacred, and I'm stealing some of Justin's thunder, but NADCAP really demonstrated what can happen within an industry when I have a targeted process-specific accreditation. That goes from just ISO, my quality management system. It says this process is an issue. If you want to supply us, you have to be up here. So why aren't small and mid-sized manufacturers just jumping on the NAD? Well, they jumped on the NADCAP train, honestly, because GE said, if you want to do business with us, you have to be NADCAP. It's that simple. DOD said, you want to do heat treating for our products? You got to have NADCAP. It's going to be in your contract, so you got to meet the standard. Shouldn't have to do it, but that is the reality of it. And why is that? As a former owner-operator, I'll tell you, my portfolio of investment opportunities is finite. And I'm doing a business case calculation on all of them. I have the expertise. I have the resources. They're finite. They're not what Boeing has. They're not what Lockheed has. But I have resources to do it if I wanted to, but I'm not, because the contract doesn't say I have to. I don't see the revenue there. On NADCAP, they said, you want a long-term contract? Get NADCAP. They came to us and said, hey, we need help on this electrical component. Will you guys invest in developing it for us to develop an alternative? Sure. What's the other side of the equation? 5-year long-term contract, we're going to have to compete it, but you guys will have a government part number, which will give you a competitive advantage. Okay. We invested in it. It was our most profitable product. It's those types of engagements that have to happen for this part of the supply chain to come around. We've done a little bit of this through MEP. So we're helping a slice of the supply chain prepare for Metacred, which is really I call the NADCAP of the medical device industry, right? Plastics, PCB assemblies, heat treating, those have been targeted by the OEMs, by the way, as critical processes that need to get addressed in the same way NADCAP addressed heat treating for turbine blades. So we work with a slice of the industry. But I will tell you, there are some progressive owner-operators who say, we see the need, we think it's going to help our operation, it's going to improve our quality, we're going to go do it. I'd say that is the vast minority. Most are doing exactly what I just mentioned, which is, what's the calculation here? Are OEMs going to require it? I don't really see that on the horizon. What about tier one? What about the government? No. Maybe you're on a preferred list where maybe you get preferred or get RFPs ahead of, nah. I have these other development projects over here that I'm going to work on. That's the calculation. That's what has to get addressed with this part of the supply chain if we're going to make any progress. So that's it for me. Hopefully I didn't go over my 10-minute allotment. But if you need to get in touch, Here's some information. Look forward to talking more on the panel.
Thanks, Scott. Justin, where's everybody else?
Overview, and then I'll hand it back to the panel.
Go for it.
All right.
They can.
Yeah, we can bring the panel up.
All right.
Very annoying. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Sit here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
What's that? Yeah, I'm doing just a quick recap of what you dug into.
Maybe I'll go over.
And then I'll hand it over to the panel. Is it okay to get started here?
Oh, absolutely.
All right.
Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I apologize for standing in front of you. I'll sit next to you here in a second. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of the things that Scott just discussed. And I'm Justin McCabe, by the way. I'm operations manager for the MetaCred program. And really I want to talk about how quality connects to the supply chain resiliency equation. Wanted to just pull up this quote from Kevin Nelson, Chief Procurement Officer at BD. He put this in an article recently in Procurement Magazine, really highlighting that 80% of the supply chain disruptions that BD saw came from the tier 3, 4, and below suppliers, and really highlighting the lack of visibility of those suppliers and having the relationship and the collaboration with those suppliers. And I think this is a common theme that I've been hearing from other medtech OEMs, from the regulators and other government agencies as well. So this is really where Scott Shine was discussing, tying into where the recalls are coming from, and other issues in the supply chain. So really, looking at where do we focus to identify the risk and the benefits in driving quality down into the supply chain. So starting with the purchasing and looking at not only making decisions on selecting suppliers from a pure cost perspective, but looking at the quality side of things as well. And Scott mentioned flow down, and really ensuring that the customer requirements are going down through the tiers in the supply chain, ensuring that that last supplier in the supply chain is receiving and can interpret the requirements coming from their final customer, and then also being able to flow up the information back to that customer if there are issues, if there are concerns, if there's questions about what that requirement means and how to interpret it. From a surveillance and supply chain monitoring perspective, really ensuring that those critical suppliers through the tiers in the supply chain are continuing to perform at a high level over time, right? And if there are issues in the supply chain, make sure that the customer is notified if an issue occurs, and then can take appropriate action. And then from a quality management perspective, making sure that you're increasing the focus on supply chain review, including purchasing controls, traceability, and acceptance activities. Scott mentioned NADCAP, and it's a program that my organization, the Performance Review Institute, has been administering for over 30 years, and really has brought the aerospace industry together in a very unique way. Subject matter experts in a number of different critical process areas, all the way from castings and forgings to heat treating to welding to printed circuit board assembly. Experts from the suppliers and the OEMs are working together in a collaborative environment to really develop very detailed audit criteria in a number of these areas, selecting subject matter expert auditors that will then go out and conduct a detailed technical assessment of a supplier's capability, regardless of where they are around the world. So, for example, if there's a printed circuit board assembly facility in Malaysia, or a printed or a cable and wire harness manufacturer in somewhere in India, our auditors will go spend 3-4 days on the shop floor, talking to the operators, looking at the equipment, making sure that that supplier has the highest level of capability for that particular process. So the NADCAP approach has been very effective. We're conducting around 7,000 audits a year globally in 25 different critical processes, all the way, way down in the tiers in the supply chain, all the way up through the tier 1s and 2s. And then all of that audit information is captured in a single location that all of the aerospace OEMs, and now the medical device OEMs as well through Metacred, have access to that audit information, very detailed audit reports that show the nonconformances, how a supplier was able to address those nonconformances and put in corrective actions that would be sustained over time. So that information is available to the OEMs to really support quality decisions, as well as procurement and sourcing decisions. Really, if they're looking to dual source, or if they're developing a new product, how can they identify a high-performing supplier that one has the capability and can perform at a high level over time. And then from a visibility perspective, yes, and then flexibility. If a company is looking to move suppliers around the world, or reshore or onshore, there's a long list of suppliers to select from. So that's a little bit about Metacred and NADCAP, and we could probably spend another couple of hours really digging into the details of how it all works and the value it brings to the industry. But from a resiliency perspective, and what Metacred is doing to really provide more flexibility and visibility to the industry, in conversations with FDA and Department of Commerce and our industry partners, we, about a year ago, put together a working group to really figure out how do we drive quality down through the tiers in the supply chain to really enhance the resiliency of those downstream suppliers. So what we've been doing is, Metacred has been around for 10 years, where we have about 10 different leading medical device OEMs that are leading the charge, like Medtronic and Baxter and Becton Dickinson and Stryker. And we're conducting around 100 audits a year. But how do we as an industry really grow that to thousands, where you can be assured that if you're looking for a printed board assembly manufacturer, regardless of where they're located around the world, regardless of their size, so they could be a small or medium-sized organization or a large contract manufacturer, that if you're looking for that printed board assembly manufacturer, you'll have confidence that they have the capability, that they have the infrastructure in their place, the procedures, et cetera. So what we're doing as a working group is really identifying barriers to implementing Metacred more broadly. We're prioritizing those critical process areas that are highest risk to the industry and are causing the most pain to industry, like sterilization, like sterile packaging, injection molding, heat treating, welding. We're also, and I think this has been a common theme this week, is what does FDA think about all this, right? And really providing the members on our working group some clarification on how to interpret the regulations from a purchasing controls perspective, and how Metacred fits into that. So that's been a really valuable part of the working group as well. And then in addition, how do you plug and play the Metacred program? It's the medtech companies are large, complex organisms that it's hard to change. So what are some best practices that our OEM subscribers have been identifying and capturing in a single playbook that can be utilized? So I'm going to stop talking and going to jump back over here to the panel to really kind of dig into the different aspects of supply chain resiliency and some of those best practices in the industry, so that we can kind of give the audience here some takeaways that you can use within your organizations. So Ed, I don't want to come over and we'll start the conversation. All right. Well, thank you. I think, yeah, we've got an awesome panel here from perspectives from a lot of different parts of the industry, all the way from sub-tier suppliers. We have Ed Engelhardt here with Solar Atmosphere as it could be a tier 3 or 4 supplier in the industry. We have representatives from the medtech manufacturers themselves, from the regulatory angle, and consultants. So, so I'm really excited to dig into this topic from a lot of different angles. But where I'd like to start, and really continuing the theme of best practices from other industries, I wanted to start off with the Ed Engelhardt and Scott Shine, really talking about how can the medtech industry enhance supply chain resilience by drawing from aerospace and automotive sectors, and what challenges and considerations might apply when implementing these practices in the medtech space. So I think, yeah, if there's any other perspectives there that you'd like to share.
Yeah, I'll give the aerospace, well, my view of the aerospace view. So NADCAP actually became ubiquitous within the industry when GE said, this is what we're going to do. So what does that mean? That means leadership. So someone in the industry said, this is what we're going to do. We're GE, Jack Welch, right? I mean, this is Jack. This is the industry's going to follow me because I'm Jack Welch. And that's what happened. And I think that's the type of disruptive behavior, disruptive leadership necessary in order for something similar to occur within med device. An OEM or two, or tier 1 or 2 need to say, this is what we're going to do. It's the right thing to do. We're going to do it. Yes, it's going to create some disruption. We're going to roll it out over some period of time. GE didn't just snap their fingers and have turbine blades that were heat treated in NADCAP. It took some time, but they had a plan, and they implemented it methodically. And guess what happened? The industry followed. The industry followed. Everyone's, well, if GE's doing it, then we're going to have to do it, or else they're going to have a competitive advantage. So we're going to go do it. And DOD suddenly said, yep, that's going to be in all our contract. And it's just a domino effect. That, to me, is what really, we're on the edge of that here at Med Device. But someone has to run through the door. Who's going to run through the door and say, for these processes, I need this level of accreditation for you to be in my supply chain? Who's going to do that? We're not there yet. And I've heard, I'm not mentioning names, I've heard different OEMs say different things, different tier 1 say it's very much a risk equation right now on supply chain. And the pandemic exaggerated it to some degree, because everyone's sitting back going, ugh, I only have a couple of suppliers who can do this part number, or or one supplier who can do this part number. And now we're going to try and put this accreditation on them. Oh my goodness. So I go back to supplier development. So you have to strategically develop your suppliers in order to anticipate that higher level accreditation.
Oh, thank you, Scott. Ed.
Well, the effect being at the other end of the requirement to be or not to be NADCAP accredited was a real sea change for many special process or critical process suppliers in the aerospace industry. And I know when I was running a small heat treat company, and we did aerospace work, and when NADCAP came along, it was a really hard decision to make, because it was going to be a huge commitment. But the fact is, it was going to bring a degree of technical competence requirement and transparency that really did not exist prior. And we decided to take the leap because we saw advantages. We polled our customers. They had heard about it. They weren't terribly familiar with it, but they all encouraged us to go and jump on board, and we did. And we never looked back. It was a really great thing for the company that I had at that time, and it served us very well for many, many years. And in terms of resiliency, I think when you have a requirement throughout an industry that's that high a level of technical competency and transparency, you've just weeded out a lot of possible mistakes really fast for a very reasonable cost. And when you build up an adequate inventory of such companies, should you have a problem in your supply chain at a particular supplier, a flood that wipes them out, or something terrible happens to this organization that does this one key process, maybe you're not even aware who they are, but you become aware when your supply stops because of that reason. Well, you'll have literally a catalog of many other qualified candidates that will speed up your recovery from that fault, which I don't think you have today in the medical industry. You're all on your own. You're probably all looking at the same suppliers over and over again, but you don't know that. And you don't know who those other suppliers are because you get very focused on the ones you have. Metacred really provides a way to develop a inventory of good, capable suppliers that do not require a boatload of work to get on board.
Excellent comments, Ed. I don't know if any of the other panelists have any other experience or examples from other industries that could be leveraged for the med tech supply chain resiliency discussion.
I'll give you an example. So when we were originally setting up Metacred back in 2014, I attended a supplier meet from the aerospace side. And I was convinced at the end of the meet that we needed something like this in the medical industry. There were about 20,000 people that attended that meeting. I don't know how many suppliers were there, but there was hundreds. And I went into one session where they were furiously debating electroplating standards. And I can tell you, what I learned from that was that there was a certain degree of standardization that came out of that meeting, that all the suppliers that were there basically said, yep, this is how we're going to do it. And it was an eye-opener. And so when we started up Metacred, we said, well, how can this apply in our industry? Because we're regulated differently. So the FDA doesn't come out and tell us, we're going to audit you to this standard. They've got consensus standards. And so there's a big difference there, right? Because the FAA regulates them differently than the FDA does. And so we came to an understanding that if we were to take a standard and make that a consensus standard, how would that work in the medical device industry? And then we did that with the heat treatment standard, the pyrometry standard. If you remember, Justin, we went out and went with the FDA, and I think at the time it might have been Steve Silverman who was in charge, and we said, hey, listen, Steve.
I have no recollection.
How about this standard? And then we actually had Elizabeth George take that standard back to the FDA, and we actually had the consensus standard built in. But that was just one. I mean, they've got hundreds of those in the FAA that then the FAA has to follow. So I think that's a great example. I think the automotive is another great example with the 14969 and the way they manage their quality system and how they've done PPAPs, the purchase part approval process. You go to any automotive supplier today, they'll give you a PPAP for whatever you want, for your headlight, for your bumper, for whatever. We haven't got to that point yet, but what Metacred helps us do is do that audit that's a mile deep and an inch wide and say, if you're going to give me a circuit board, it's going to conform with this particular way of manufacturing it. And so we're getting some consistency, but we're really at the very beginning of that.
I think the other thing that I'd add is, while these standards need to be developed, right, what can you do now, right? What are some of the indicators of risk that you can actually try to look at now? And as we worked with our clients during the pandemic, we realized that just looking at operational risks, such as quality maturity, supply chain maturity, is not enough, right? Like, you need to have a more holistic view of what risk is, right? So one instance is looking at financial risk. So we found that there was a high correlation between companies which had poor liquidity and the quality issues that those companies had as we looked at the supplier network. Similarly, organizational risks. If you're sourcing from a site where the entire management team's tenure is either too low or too long, like 20 plus years, we found that that is again correlated to quality issues and supply issues. So I think one of the learnings that we had was that while we need the standards and that will take some time, having a more holistic sort of framework to look at risk, right, which goes beyond just operational considerations, is critical to actually secure your supply.
So I really like the the points that he brought up in terms of these other risk areas, right? When we talk even about the original question, one of the benefits I think that Medicare brings, or the construct around that, is, and we've seen it multiple times, right? It's disruption, multiple companies coming in to the supplier, and we've seen it. Some companies have gotten better about it, but it's not across the board. Imposing onto a supplier like the 1345 standard, which really it's not necessarily where they need to be, right? That's, the ownership is still, according to the reg, back onto the OEM. That tends to drive behavior in a different way. It really tries to deviate what their expertise is. It puts the supplier and their attention on the wrong pieces. And I think from an OEM standpoint, doesn't let you effectively look at other risk areas that are probably a lot more relevant, like the financial pieces or the liquidity, right? That's where it matters. And I think the beauty with the Medicred and the focus that it's got on the deep process capability, that's what's really important for that supply.
I'll add one more thing. This financials, I think, is a great point. But also, the one thing that sometimes is missing from the purchasing/supply chain area is also evaluating the supply chain capabilities of a prospective supplier, which is not a minimal task. Usually, you all have seen the surveys for new suppliers. Oftentimes, the supply chain piece is really focused on procurement, not really on supply chain or how they're managing their suppliers. That's not really a component, a major component of onboarding surveys or new supplier surveys. And so I like the financial piece of it. That needs to be a bigger part of it, but also the evaluating the supply chain capabilities of the prospective supplier, because that will uncover the tier 3, 4 issues potentially. More.
I think you make a great point there. That's great, Ed. So it turns out that when GHTF released N17, they actually wrote that into that standard. And so the companies that adopted GHTF N17 do exactly that. Yeah. But not everyone does it. And so that's where this can be very helpful.
All excellent comments.
I was just going to observe that resiliency is not inexpensive. And one of the stories I wanted to relate was around a company. It wasn't med device, it was actually pharmaceutical. But, and it was actually the internal audit group that was concerned about shareholder value and the contribution of blockbuster drugs to their profitability, to their shareholders. And typically what we had seen, this was several years ago, people were focused on disaster recovery and bringing a factory back up online. And in fact, this one company had an operation where the town was digging in the street and they disrupted the sewer, and so they couldn't operate because they couldn't get rid of their effluent. And their backup approach was to buy about 100 tanker trucks and park them in a parking lot so that next time they were digging in the sewer, they could get rid of the effluent and keep in business. What happened a few years later was a hurricane that destroyed the whole infrastructure and took them out. So this sort of spot, let me try to anticipate the risks, really doesn't work. What we ended up doing was prioritizing and saying these products are either medically necessary or contribute so much to the shareholder value that we need to protect them. And then it was down to that fourth tier. Those products receive that heavy investment in resiliency, whereas other, more competitive products where the ecosystem could afford to lose them were left more at risk. So it was less of a quality issue, but more of a dual source, and it, of course, changed all of the contracting, all the contracts, the minimum volumes needed to be revised. We factored in the idea of liquidity. If we had a sensing mechanism so that if there was a potential financial failure, in fact, the company actually bought one of its suppliers to address that liquidity issue. So I think there are different resiliency strategies that need to be considered, and certainly sensing and anticipating risk is a key part of that.
Right. An excellent point. Thanks, Pat. Wanted to just jump over to kind of I know Metacred and NADCAP, these are industry collaborative approaches, but I wanted to just expand that a little bit further and just talk about what are some of the industry collaborations that are out there that you're aware of, panelists, and some best practices there. I know, we're chairing the Quality and Resiliency Working Group. I know AdvaMed has a supply chain working group. I know the White House has an initiative as well. So maybe I'll start with you, Cisco, on what you're seeing out there, and what are you seeing as some successful collaborations from a resiliency perspective?
So I think even just the notion that there's a lot more collaboration is a big deal. A lot of the emphasis has been more on we need to partner together versus let's come up with a new regulation that requires this piece or what's going on, because I think people have found out, going back to some of the notions we talked about here beforehand, right? You need the speed, you need the agility, you need the communication. So it's not just, again, those groups, but there's lots of other parties that have kind of taken on trying to drive or demonstrate. There's a different way to do this from a supply chain standpoint. You've got Metacred, you've got even work that's being done here through the collaborative community, right? Our supply resiliency team at CDRH is actively engaged with not just some of these efforts, but with the White House and trying to build out a community of their own among the supply chain, right? To really get that partnership moving forward. You've got a lot of the America Makes Institutes, right? Who all factored together and we're trying and piloting out different ways to build resiliency. And some of those, quick win projects showed, okay, here are the right kind of directional areas to look at. So there is a massive effort around this because it's a big deal. Yeah. But the point that you were making, at least from what we've seen, it's the answer isn't necessarily in we need a new regulation. And everybody seems to have adopted and acknowledged that.
I think it's super interesting to think about what FDA's role can it be in empowering some of these initiatives, including Metacred. So yes, in fairness, I was running the Office of Compliance in the Center for Devices when Metacred was getting up and running. And I distinctly remember hearing about the Metacred initiative and saying to the champions of the initiative at the time, oh, this sounds great. FDA can't endorse any kind of private activity, but this sounds great, and if it succeeds, all to the good. And candidly, thinking about that statement today, that was really short-sighted, because Metacred is solving one of the most difficult and one of the most important issues for medical device makers. Who can I source from in a reliable way? Who can I trust? And here is this external organization that exists to help answer that question. Here is this well-developed system that has been used in other contexts that is available to inform your decisions. And I think that FDA, I'm not suggesting that FDA should change its approach and formally endorse one type of organization like Metacred over another yet. I think that there's lots of running room for FDA to send messages to the regulated community that it has evaluated a particular solution and it believes that the solution has merit. And that kind of statement, I think, is powerful. And to your point, complements nicely initiatives by industry leaders like Jack Welch in the GE context to say, this is why we're going to do it, because this stuff matters. There's a solution sitting out there that we know works. FDA likes the solution. So there's not a lot of brain power that's required to figure out if this is how we should proceed, this is how we should proceed. And then, of course, there are larger questions that need to be answered in terms, including how do you make this something that's realistic and usable for smaller and mid-sized companies so they also get the benefit of it. But a lot of benefit is going to be created by initiating this chain of uptake by industry leaders in an area where there doesn't really seem like there's that much to think about.
I think I vividly recollect our initial meetings, and I think at the time, the maturity of having completed the 8 or so pilots, which you were very supportive of, was still not there. And so we had to take essentially the printed circuit board, the plastics molding, and we had to do essentially a comparative analysis between the aerospace industry audit criteria and the medical device industry audit criteria. Because you couldn't just assume that if something was good for an airplane, it would automatically be good for a medical device. And so there was a good reason to say we can't just endorse this. But then once the pilots were done, Justin, if you remember, then it became clear that there was something like a 90% overlap. Was it 80 to 90%?
Not more, I think 95.
95% overlap between the audit criteria for those commodities. When that became clear, then it was obvious that, okay, this is the right way to go. And then I think today we're at a point where we're even doing sterilization with the endorsement, if that, I don't know if that's the right word, but from the agency, from what Medicred is trying to do with the sterilization suppliers. So we made a whole lot of progress.
Right.
We should be proud of that.
Definitely.
I'm a little bit biased, but I think our working group is pretty good. And this is the one that we formed with PRI that has reps from MDIC, industry, and not just the OEMs, but several tiers within the industry, MEP. And again, collaboration's great, and it's going to generate ideas, and it has, which has been wonderful. But one thing I'm noticing with the group is there's some leadership emerging among the collaboration. If the collaboration leads to providing some confidence for business leaders to make tough decisions like Jack made 30 years ago, that to me is the ultimate outcome for any of these collaborations. So collaborations should generate ideas, and they are, on standardization and maybe what processes we should prioritize and how do we minimize risk to our enterprise. And that's a big conversation that we've had in these working groups, is how do we minimize our supply chain risks if we do mandate some of these higher level quality standards, including Medicred. So I think, and also having a plan with these working groups, and we've had some subgroups with this working group that have been very beneficial in generating content for these businesses actually to implement in their supply chain. But I'll mention one question I asked in this meeting, and it was, your C-suite, who's aware of some of the things we've talked about today? Yeah. Are they aware that some of these small and mid-sized businesses are really driving some of the quality issues? Are they aware of some of these higher level quality standards like Medicred and some of the things that we've been talking about? The general consensus across the board was no, which that can't happen. So if you're going to collaborate, wonderful, but it has to somehow make its way up to the C-suite, or else it's going to be very difficult to implement anything coming out of these groups.
I think, from our standpoint, Medicred is an example of, once again, FDA doesn't need to drive the solution. Industry got together and drove the solution. They actually have all the power in this case because they can drive the behavior by their purchasing decisions, right? You don't necessarily need FDA. What was part of even some of the initial workgroup discussion was just clarifying, hey, all that flexibility is already allowed to you by the regulation. It's already there in the way the purchasing control reg is established. You have the capability to establish this as a standard as an industry, accept it, and move forward with that. And you don't necessarily want us to be in the weeds of your supply chain, right? That's not going to be beneficial for anyone and everyone down the road. And that idea of the agility that we need to help build the resiliency, it starts to go away. Right?
I think, look, Cisco, I think your point is excellent, and I listened very carefully when you made it before, and I thought that you were right in that context. I definitely think that you're right here. And I guess my question for you, for others, including folks in the audience, is like, does it matter when FDA says X is a good thing? So to your question, how do you get
absolutely.
C-suite engagement?
Yes.
When you have leadership like yourself, like the folks that you work with, the agencies saying, for example, hypothetically, Metacred's excellent, or we love the idea of creating a screened set of suppliers who are reliable and can help drive device quality and integrity. Like, no,
Yeah.
FDA is not leading the effort, but it seems to me that it's a critical
Oh,
champion.
believe me, they are looking to see if Cisco's nodding his head.
Okay.
They are looking. Okay.
And I'm seeing, so great, and I'm also seeing some nodding heads in the audience, which suggests to me that companies are actually paying attention, and when FDA endorses something without adopting,
Right.
it matters that those messages land.
No, I can appreciate that, and I think the balancing act here has been to say, how do we recognize that there is value here when there is value here? Let me just say that here, that there is value in what gets done and the work that Metacred is doing, without then feeling like it's FDA saying, hey, this is the only mechanism, right?
Sure.
So I get to your point, because ideally it should be the industry that matters, but there is something that FDA can do to help kickstart that, right? And the first pass of that was saying, hey, this is well within the regs. We can accept this. How do we then get that to be, a little bit more, I guess, resonating for some of the C-suite?
I think the other piece for the C-suite is also that for resilience, there hasn't been a very clear business case presented to a C-suite, right? It's often looked at as insurance. There isn't really a clear benefit that you invest X million dollars, you get Y million out of it, laid out over these 5 years, right? So I think that has been the challenge, right? So companies that have faced severe product availability issues and have seen the revenue and growth suffer have been amenable to making investments. Some others, because of whatever reason, they had higher inventory levels compared to their competitors and have been cushioned by the impacts, don't see the business case. So I think one of the ways to activate the C-suite is actually to articulate that business case, right? On what does the investment actually get you.
Yeah, I think it's viewed as a quality initiative. We have 100 of those a day, quality initiatives, in any of these larger organizations, right? I mean, we got plenty of them. This is just kind of gets thrown on the pile. It's more than that. It's a supply chain initiative. It's not a quality initiative. And so framing, I like that. So really framing in that way, but it's usually your quality lead who's communicating that to the C-suite. And what are they communicating? Well, we're going to reduce our defects, all good things, reduce our defects and our processes, all good stuff. But again, the C-suite is thinking in terms of what? Business case.
I found that the places where I implemented Metacred, where it was successful, was doing exactly that. Not just viewing it as a quality initiative, but actually having a partnership with the Chief Procurement Office as a strategy for risk reduction overall from a holistic supply chain perspective. It should really not be presented as a pure quality initiative. Chances of success are much, much greater when represented as a supply chain initiative with the endorsement of the senior most executive responsible for procurement. In my case, it was easier because I was a direct report into the Chief Procurement Officer. At the same time, a direct report into the Chief Quality Officer. But I was sitting right in that leadership meeting, and I could say, here's the business case for why. And so it was an easier sell, I think. But I think the message is still the same. I wholeheartedly agree with you. It's got to come across as a supply chain initiative, not just as a quality initiative.
All great comments, and I really, I think very helpful to kind of frame the value of a Metacred, industry managed approach. Are there other collaborative approaches, either folks on the panel or can expand this into folks in the audience, both virtually and in person. Anything else that you're seeing out there as best practice that we should be keeping an eye on? And if not, that's fine.
Got one on.
Oh, we have a question virtually. My chief procurement officer was also the QARA manager. Any advice?
I would say you had the best of both worlds then.
Yeah.
No reason not to move forward with it.
Make his life easier.
Yeah.
I think it's difficult to gauge what the advice you're seeking is, right? Where's the challenge or the concern? If it's a question of, does the QARA hat interfere with the procurement? Does the procurement interfere with the QARA? I think the approach that you would take varies depending on what the situation is.
Right. Yeah, and whenever I see the word procurement, I'm not sure it's viewed as a supply chain management function. There's a distinct difference. Procurement is very transactional. Go buy stuff. Just, here, cut POs, go buy stuff, buy it from the same suppliers. That's very transactional. I don't know that that's the case here. If that is the case, then I would say you need to beef up the procurement supply chain piece of this to balance out the QA component of it, because supply chain is very strategic. It can be both good and not so great to have that in the same functional area. But I think as it relates to what we're talking about, it can be very beneficial if that is truly a supply chain management function.
I think the other challenge, and I agree with you, I think you make a really good point. The other challenge I've found is that a classical procurement organization, and I don't mean just purchasing, but the actual procurement function, is very much productivity driven in the sense that they're looking for X% reduction in the bill of materials over time. So let's say if it's a 5% target or a 6% target, whatever the target is, when you go to them with this proposal for Metacred, which actually adds the cost from their perspective, because it does cost to get into the program and to run it, then the question becomes, well, what's the incremental productivity that you're going to get me by being in the program? And that's where you got to have a really nice business case, and you got to have a really nice elevator speech. And so you should be able to tell a C-suite person within 30 seconds how much money you can save them by investing this much money in Metacred. And if you can do that, it's a cakewalk after that. But if you can't, it just runs into all sorts of questions.
Has everyone here ever heard the term total cost of ownership as it relates to supply chain? I think that's what you're talking about.
Exactly.
It's really like total cost of ownership perspective. It's just a purely transactional procurement perspective, you'll never get there. It would need to be a total cost of ownership perspective. You can almost envision a waterfall that has all the components of risk and cost in there in order to make a strategic purchasing decision, which is different than I need my 2%, please.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Great point.
So,
No, there's somebody else.
oh, no. Questions in the back?
a
Oh,
line.
awesome. I couldn't see behind the pillar.
Hey everyone, thanks for the great conversation. I'm just curious, Nicole Taylor-Smith from Philips. We're just brainstorming, thinking about programs like Metacred and partnerships with FDA and other regulators. And I started to think, if I went into my C-suite, what would I say and what is the pitch? And so I started thinking, well, would there be an opportunity like case for quality or other things that if you said all of my suppliers are Metacred certified, maybe when you have your routine audit, they don't have to actually, FDA or a regulator doesn't have to audit the suppliers or supplier controls because that that's been covered already. That would be, we can make a financial pitch into what would that mean. Or, we do supplier audits inside, and high cost of that too. Is there a business case that if we use Metacred, there could be some cost savings there too? So starting to think about what are the different kinds of incentives to get other manufacturers to say, actually, there is a business case here in addition to the enormous patient safety case here too. Has FDA or others had conversations about that? Or are there evidence that maybe Metacred has used that companies could take and say, here's some of the science-based evidence we've seen with other companies who have used that?
So I know as part of the working group when we started the whole clarification process on things, those exact opportunities or potential examples came up. And the response is actually, it's it's well within your capability to set it up and structure it that way. And yes, FDA would accept that, right? It's the, within the way you control and oversee your suppliers, you've got all the flexibility in the world to determine what's right for your process, your risk, your tolerance around that. I will let anybody here who's either worked with Metacred or had gone through that activity to talk to the benefits about reducing supplier audits and how that gets implemented. But that is, again, well within your capability to establish. I go back to the notion that all of this you can do, just make sure you put it in your process.
But my understanding, just to add to the point that you're making, is that FDA is not in a position where it is going to formally endorse Metacred and say, for a company like Philips, for example, that in the context of an FDA inspection indicates that it is Metacred compliant participant, that's going to become a replacement for independent agency evaluation of appropriate supplier controls. So my question, two questions. A, is that right? B, is there any kind of possibility of a de facto shorthand? So no, FDA is not going to say, oh, you're Metacred
But you could have
participant.
any certification. The issue you're talking about is a specific company. But let's say there are other people doing that kind of same certification. Then you say anybody who has this kind of certification or the standard of, that might be something you can consider.
Right. Where is right? Are there right? I mean, I take your point, Nicole. Are there strategies that allow FDA to either explicitly or implicitly endorse Metacred and organizations like it?
So the answer to that broadly in just a high level is yes. How we get that is the nuance, right? Because the reality of the matter is, unless there is a clear supplier issue, the FDA typically doesn't go from the medical device side into the supplier weeds, right?
Yeah.
It's got to be a fundamental failure we've seen either with how the companies or the whole sector has failed with a specific supply set for us to then drop down to that tier, right? That responsibility falls on the manufacturer, and if you could demonstrate you're in control, that's it, because you're the one who's going to be held accountable. So, the idea of building in here is how we monitor risk, and these suppliers who are even high-risk ones, much better controlled through Metacred and their certification process, and we are accepting that in lieu of all these things for our business needs. That would be acceptable from an FDA standpoint, right? That's basically, how we can move the needle on this piece. We've done work with, and again, it's the whole piece of not getting into the weeds of the supply chain and how you oversee that as a company. But, we've been working with Metacred, and the opportunity that actually fell on our laps was the idea of the sterilization process being part of the equation, because that does fall in our purview. And that gave us an opportunity to participate and engage with the process to see it in action, right? And I think there'll be work, we'll publish out what the findings of that are, but that I think will go a long way to say, here's what we saw and what we thought about the process overall. All right, but can you do it? Can you do it now? Absolutely, and that's what we as FDA would acknowledge when we go in and verify.
Perfect, thank you.
I think you explained that really well, Cisco. Thank you. Nicole, I found three things very useful in selling this to the C-suite. One is that we are conducting special process audits of suppliers, and that counts towards the total number of audits that are done. So in terms of cost of those audits, if I was doing 1,000 audits a year, and if I had 50 of them done as special process audits, I would count them as 1,050. And so that would be a return on investment. Or I could say, I only have to conduct 950 now because I did 50 of them as special process audits. So that's useful. The second thing is, if something bad happens, let's say you didn't have someone do a proper hand soldering job. Maybe the solder iron tip temperature wasn't quite right, Justin.
Yeah.
And if that happened and it caused a recall, I would then say, had I had this process, I would have actually saved you, Mr. C-Suite, the $2 million that we spent on this recall. And that pays for the program for the next 5 years, right? And then the third thing is just the basic plea that don't you want to get better? We're doing all these QMS audits that really don't, as someone else pointed out, I think Cisco, you might have been, hey, you're doing QMS audits to suppliers that really don't really understand what ISO 13485 is and really don't care to. And frankly, and I think Ed made this, it's the same supplier that's supplying to 50 different, manufacturers. Now the supplier's having 50 audits to field instead of one Metacred audit. How does that do for efficiency, and how does that drive down the cost of procurement? Those three arguments sell Metacred cold, and from my experience. I just want to share that perspective.
Thank you, Ravi. Another question.
My name is Michael Ezzo. I'm with Steris, so I contract sterilization. So it's very kind of pointed time to ask this question, or maybe talk about this topic. You guys are talking a lot about the perspective of the procuring side, not necessarily from the supplier side. So obviously, from our perspective, there is potentially a differentiation having that Metacred certification. And then there's also a value proposition in being able to say maybe we can eliminate the 50 to 100 supplier audits that come in every year. So I guess really the comment, or what I'd ask for your comment on, is how is this group, and how is FDA, as well as the people who are going to C-suite, selling that? How are you creating that? Because from my perspective, that's where there's value. There's significant value there. So that's something that it's not just from the supplier side. It's how do we sell it to the suppliers? So
we deal with the suppliers every day, as you do. And the feedback is, in regards to this specific topic, is where's the revenue? Yeah, the audit reduction is great. Quality improvements are wonderful. What's the growth path here? Because you are not the only thing I'm investing in. I have this portfolio of programs or projects or contracts or customers that I could potentially invest in. This is one of them. So I'm looking at revenue. So until the industry says, I'm going to put this in my contracts, I'm putting this in my supply chain process, I'm putting this into procurement, and leadership says this is what we're going to do in the Jack Welch way, that's the calculation that's made. Some companies are progressive and say, I see what you're talking about. And I see the impact, the positive impact on my company. So I'm not saying that's the 100%, but I would say that 90+% probably view it in the way that I'm calculating it, because that's the response that we get when we engage them on, hey, we're a resource that can help you earn this accreditation. That's publicly funded. And they still say, what's the growth opportunity here? Are they mandating this? No. Okay, call us when they are.
I think one of the things that we've been exploring with regards to the sterilizers, right? Because again, they are uniquely in our regulatory authority, is similar to what we did with VIP, right? There is an information exchange that helps us maintain the oversight. And with that coming in, we can look at what then we need differently from our review standpoints, right? Which then allow us to talk about how do we then offer more flexibility, or can we streamline certain things on that end? And that's part of what we're looking to explore here, right? What is it that we get from this opportunity and what Metacred does in comparison? Because that becomes, to your point, a factor, right? Again, it kickstarts the process, at least in the discussions.
Yeah, and again, I appreciate the feedback there, because it's something that we talk about every time with how do we grow Metacred as a program, and I have to look at it from my own personal perspective to say how does it continue to benefit our organization to expand it, and I think there's an inherent benefit, but I think the more that's being endorsed, the more value that we see as an organization, the more willingness that like we've seen in the VIP program, we've invested significantly in that, because we see beyond just the regulatory benefits. We see value in the feedback we get from people like George, who's left, so I can't even give him credit while he's gone. But we see a lot of value there in getting that, and I think that's something that we're looking forward to in the Metacred program as well. So
Yeah.
I appreciate you answering the question, so thank you, John.
Mark Gavage-Genovese. I saw in NADCAP you talked about they having a conference and you have lots of people, and they were talking about standards development within that group. And so the FDA has consensus standards, and the industry uses the consensus standards or others. Is there something in Metacred that's tying the standards for the different types of suppliers together so you know that this is the kind of standards that they're using?
So Metacred develops detailed audit criteria for each of these critical process areas that relies on industry standards as well as best practices and even customer-specific requirements that are all baked into that audit criteria. And actually, we've been talking about heat treating. That's one area where the industry standard AMS 2750 is embedded within our heat treating audit criteria. And we actually worked with FDA for a number of years to get that on that list of recognized standards. And so, I know there are other standards within our audit criteria that we'd love to continue the conversation with FDA to get added to the list. But
yeah, I think where there is a standard that's applicable, we've been open to the sterilization pieces. There's a lot of standards within that space that we've already recognized, and that becomes part of what's audited to or the criteria. So where it's been done or it makes sense, we've been open, and as it moves forward, as it expands, then yeah, that becomes an option.
Yeah, I'd say in the spirit of collaboration, the development of the Metacred audit criteria is open to all industry stakeholders. So it's not just the medtech OEMs, but we encourage the supplier and contract manufacturer input into that as well. So it's open to all, and welcome anyone who wants to get involved in developing the sterilization audit criteria or the injection molding audit criteria, or wherever you're passionate about or have expertise in. Let me know, and we'll get you connected.
I think the strength of that standard process in Metacred, from my experience, is it doesn't necessarily go after the whole standard, because it's an industry-contributed audit criteria checklist. We may choose to not include certain parts of a standard that are not relevant to that particular industry segment. And I've seen that when all these brilliant minds come together and create that audit criteria, it actually comes out sometimes even stronger than the standard itself, because there's best practices to bring in from their own experience. And I'm thinking printed circuit boards is probably a pretty good area where a whole lot of thought's been put into that.
Right.
Yeah. A610, is it?
Good point, Ravi. Ed, did you have a follow-up?
One of the changes that has occurred in NADCAP and the aerospace world in general is that many of these standards, when they were originally written, and even currently, whoever wrote them never really anticipated strict auditing to them. And the language was okay, but it left room for interpretation or problems that might arise in applying them to the product at hand. And one thing we found in the aerospace world is the committees that write, say, AMS standards talk to NADCAP now in the given commodity when they're working on a standard. And this is a very collaborative thing. And there's now a lot of knowledge sharing where when standards do get revised, the input from the audit world comes to play and cleans up the language, makes it more specific, removes unintended consequences, and makes the standard better and stronger for everybody who's involved. It's been a very interesting progression. It's taken a very long time to get to that. And I serve on the AMEC committee at AMS, and we're always talking back and forth with NADCAP, or actually even, the Metacred Heat Treat Task Group has input to it as well. And the same thing is now finally starting to happen in ASTM, where a lot of the standards, and I've used my world because that's the one I'm familiar with, hardness testing, mechanical testing, they're getting feedback from the auditing group, NADCAP in particular, about what they find problematic when they audit a standard whose language is, say, less than ideal. And it's having a very good effect on standard writing as becoming more clear and pointed and bringing the right intention to the criteria to meet the standard.
Good perspective.
Hey everyone, great discussion. Quick question. So Dave DeLuca from Compliance Group. One of the things that comes up for us with being both on the component manufacturer side or subassembly manufacturer side and the device manufacturer side is the whole validation piece, right? So every time, especially with critical processes like packaging, sterilization, critical subassemblies, there's the whole process validation PQ element to it. So is there anything that you guys maybe are working towards to prove maybe a streamlined like kind of comparability between either, even if it's the same site, right? Like multiple Steris sites or multiple sterilization houses. Is there a way to kind of streamline that process so that it's easier, and less financially costly to have multiple suppliers for these areas?
I think ideally, and again, process validation, there's always going to be the unique element of the product involved, right? But what we gain from all this is confidence in the organization's capability to deliver that process. So then the review becomes a lot more streamlined, right? We're not looking for all those process elements that are part of our traditional review now. It's the technical data of what happened for that specific product, right? So yes, there is potential for it to impact in that validation space, right? The level of effort, I think, that's required to prove to us as an agency that it's valid, right? Or for you as an organization to prove it's valid. Ideally, yeah, we should be able to say, hey, you got a sterilization process. These are all Metacred sites. We'd like to enable, especially when it's needed. How quickly can you move to one location or another if situation calls for it without a lot of regulatory burden, I think, from that standpoint.
And if I could just share a story regarding this, when we were building out the Metacred checklist, we did a gap assessment between what the aerospace industry checklist was and what the Metacred medical device industry checklist needed to be. And we found that the reference specifically to process validation, especially as the auditors specifically go after 820.70I, process validation, was missing. So what we did was we actually had a side-by-side comparison, and we had, I think, someone from Johnson & Johnson at the time and a few other companies sit down and bring us their best practices for process validation. And then Justin and his team incorporated those best practices into the audit criteria. I think we were doing printed circuit boards at the time as the first. And so when you look at that audit criteria checklist from Metacred today, you will find specific reference to FDA requirements for process validation that the auditors will go check against. So I just thought I'd share that because it's a great question, and it begs the next question, what about things like CSA? And I think that might be something we could do in the future, but it certainly has built into it today the FDA requirements for validation for special processes.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like, for example, you have 3 or 4 different packaging houses, right? Is there a way, even if it's the same company, right? Is there a way to prove comparability without redoing PQ at each one of these things? Because, it's 6 figures, 3 months of time. I could see that being kind of pushed to the wayside as a priority, and putting kind of all your eggs in one basket, 1 or 2 suppliers.
I'll
instead
let
of
Justin
saying,
respond.
hey,
That's a
5.
great point, David. It really depends on how the audit mechanism is set up, and I think it's very specific to site. So when they go look at a particular supplier, if they're doing packaging a certain way, and let's say that supplier is based in Mexico, and then they go look at the same supplier elsewhere, if it's in North America or Europe, it's going to be 2 separate audits with 2 separate implementations, and it's 2 separate IQ, OQ, PQs is my understanding so far.
Yeah, the Metacred audit criteria across all of our technologies does, and like Ravi said, it was a big initiative for our industry members to really identify best practices and looking at the GHDF guidance for process validation and coming up with a set criteria for expectations for IQ, OQ, PQ, and so, but at a higher level, and then, is that being applied consistently, across multiple sites?
But there may be some opportunities to, these are work groups that work very collaboratively. So if there's an opportunity to improve something, by all means, now that you guys know each other, just kind of get into the work group.
I'd be welcome to jump in.
It's industry oversight, really. So
Yeah, it is.
improve the process as best as you can.
And I think the key thing to note is theoretically, yeah, there's a possibility, right? What we need to do is answer the questions of, are there any gaps in information that we would need? to make sure that the oversight's sustained, right? And that's the piece that we're talking about and exploring. But if you talk about from a theoretical standpoint, yeah, that's a possibility. I think one of the pieces of the Metacred activity that, we've been talking a lot about the audits and everything else, and Justin, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the big benefits that I've also seen in the way it operates that, I think we lose sight of how important and critical that is when something goes wrong, there is a network of experts that comes in and tackles the issue with the supplier. There's communication across that supply chain, right? So that to the point of the whole resiliency piece or the impact, there's a lot more management and control around that. And that is, from a lot of where we see some disruptions come in, a huge benefit, right? It's after the fact, but it's still, again, collectively the industry coming together to quickly address the problem that they need with the right expertise at that level.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Cisco, and one we've touched on a little bit here, but yeah, having that really pulse on a supplier, and we had an example of a cable wire harness supplier that our auditor identified a major nonconformance. I think the nickel levels were too high or something within their chemistry, and so all of our subscribing OEMs were notified. This cable wire harness supplier had a major nonconformance. This was the issue, and they all reviewed that audit report, and a few of the subscribers identified them as one of their suppliers, and they put together a Tiger team to go in and address that issue and determine if it had impacted any of their products or how to resolve that issue quickly. So that's just one example, and it really is. They didn't have to wait a couple of years before seeing that issue in the product before taking action.
To Jason's point, this just makes Kappa cooler. I go from Kappa to Kappa.
Yeah. I'm just struck by, I think, the need to frame the work that's being done in this context in the midst of stories that can be told to C-suite representatives, whether it's the leader of the organization or other C-suite members. So there's, as with many of the issues that we've discussed over the last 2 days, a great deal of depth and expertise. And I think that to take a contrary position, it just wouldn't work. I mean, it's just very apparent that all of these issues are very, very well thought out. At the same time, as we've discussed, at the end of the day, this stuff all costs money, and there are competing concerns inside of organizations. Everybody has got their hand raised, asking for money to do what they want to do that will help the organization succeed. So there's got to be framing in terms of the successful work of this group in the context of gains that can be made by the organization and messages that will resonate with the organization's leaders and the decision makers about how money is going to be spent and where priorities are placed.
Yeah. Excellent comments, Steve.
I have a question, and
Sure, Pat.
Cisco raised the issue of monitoring. Is the monitoring in the form of repeated audits over a certain frequency, or is there a continuous data feed that's part of the Metacred approach?
So yeah, the Metacred audits are done, a full re-audit is done every year. So it's 12-month frequency. And then in between audits, if any issues are identified by a customer or even self-identified by the supplier, that could trigger a re-audit in between the normal 12-month
So the audit is the mechanism.
So the audit is the mechanism, right. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Actually, as a follow-up to that, and maybe from the NADCAP experience base, is that also the case at NADCAP? I'd assume that they've got more
Yes, it is.
continuous monitoring capability.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the great advantages of NADCAP being the size that it is now is that when there's a major problem at a supplier, everybody knows about it. And I mean, not just the handful of people that go to a meeting, there's literally the whole aerospace prime community knows about it, and they're ready to take action. Sometimes it's, that's not that big a problem for us, and for others it's like get a team together, we got to go in and get this fixed. So that acts as a kind of an early warning mechanism to a problem that might otherwise not manifest until, it harms a patient in this case, or compromises a clinician.
Yeah. Well, I see we are about 5 minutes from the end of our time here, but I was thinking with the last minutes that we have, you're just going down the line, things that you're thinking. I know a lot of this conversation focused on Metacred, and I know it is, from my perspective, a wonderful program. But Metacred or other resiliency-related topics, what do you think is next in this space? Where the biggest opportunities? Maybe what are some of the hurdles? So maybe each of you in 30 seconds, 30 to 60 seconds, share your thoughts. So we'll start at the end with Ravi.
I think there's some opportunity with safe space to the point that was just made by Ed. When a problem occurs within the medical device supply space, how quickly can that problem be known to the whole community so that appropriate actions can be taken within that community? And what's the mechanism for having that happen? That's probably the next step, assuming that we will continue to grow Metacred. But really, that is kind of the sort of the thread that ties us all, is can we all take action in a safe space on a problem that we've identified through Metacred or other means?
I think from a company standpoint, right, then where we see most clients evolving to is on two dimensions. One is creating visibility, getting into that tier and really understanding that end-to-end supply chain. And the second is what we touched upon earlier, like continuous monitoring. What are the leading indicators of issues? How do you actually get ahead of a problem before it becomes a problem, right? So I don't think that problem has been solved yet, but I think that is really the next step.
I'll be a little bit of a broken record on the leadership topic in really trying to push leadership down the road of requiring suppliers to have a higher level standard, whether it's Metacred or some other form. It doesn't necessarily have to be Metacred, but we like Metacred because it's more standardized. And that leads me to the second point, which is around supplier development. We've danced around it a little bit in the talks, but in order to manage the risk that your C-suite is going to be focused on, we talked about the business case. The risk, when we asked OEMs, so, well, what's your concern here? It's the risk. They see the business. They see the improvement. They see all that. It's supply chain disruption that they are concerned about. You are going to move out my product development timeline. You're going to cost me revenue on this new product introduction. If we're doing supplier development and developing that supply chain, not just at the tier 1 level, but further down, which is where we're seeing the defects originate, then that enables the C-suite to manage that risk a little bit better. So when we have those conversations with them, and it's a supply chain discussion, not a quality discussion, we're able to move them further down the road.
So I see Metacred as a critical piece of the puzzle, but there are many more pieces of the puzzle. And the issues that I normally see are transfer of IP and contracting restrictions that make it very difficult to move a process from one supplier to another. They might both be accredited, but the contractual limitations or IP ownership make it very difficult to have a resilient supply chain. So I think there is an area where the whole industry could perhaps do some brainstorming to figure out how to improve or reduce the latency of transfer of IP.
We need an elevator pitch for Metacred. We need to explain succinctly to business leaders why Metacred is the right tool to help drive business success and why they should care about it.
Justin, you have homework.
I'm on it.
So I think it echoes things that were said already here. It's also where our supply resiliency team is going, right? It's how do you create that broader visibility and communication across the different levels, across different relevant stakeholders, so you can get ahead of the curve, so you can be more predictive. But also kind of exploring, and I like the suggestions, right? There's resiliency indicators that are not our traditional metrics or things we monitor, right? How do we get to some of those?
One of the things that Metacred provides is visibility in the supply chain from the OEM perspective, which really in many cases doesn't exist down to tiers 3 and 4 and lower. Yet those are places where a product can come to a complete stop and not be known for days, if not weeks at a time, before it becomes a critical situation in your own ability to deliver. Participating in Metacred gives you the way to see what is going on down in those reaches of the supply chain that you don't normally have exposure to. And it's a great tool for managing risk and hazard in your supply chain.
Well said, all, and yeah, given me some homework as well, so thank you for that. No, I wanted to thank you all for your time and your sharing your thoughts and experiences and perspectives on this really important topic that I know is top of mind for really the entire medtech industry. So yeah, thank you, and thank you, audience, for participating in the conversation as well. And thank you. Have a great rest of your day.